let's go to the last part here. Had to throw this in because Emily is here, our resident culture war expert, I think. Let's go ahead and put this up there on the screen. A California reparations panel has okayed a state apology and payments.
I like how they put apology first.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, it's kind of funny. They say, let's go ahead and get into it here a little bit. California's Reparations Task Force has voted Saturday to approve recommendations on how the state may compensate and apologize to Black residents for generations of harm caused by discriminatory policies. The 9-member committee, convened 2 years ago, has given final approval at this meeting in Oakland to a list of proposals that now go to state lawmakers to consider for reparations legislation. Barbara Lee is actually co-sponsoring this bill in Congress to study restitution proposals for African Americans. Reparations are not only morally justifiable, they say, but they have the potential to address long-standing racial disparities. One of the recommendations included here in the legislation, Emily, is payments apparently up to $1 million in some cases per resident. Now, I think this is always a hot topic. It's one people feel very strongly about, and it's one where I think it really bears scrutiny in terms of not just Black Americans, how do all Americans generally feel about this issue? The polling on it is actually quite complicated. One of the better approximations that I try to come to is affirmative action. So affirmative action effectively is like an in-kind, an in-kind acknowledgement of discrimination and it's almost like in-kind reparations. Can we agree on that definition? I think that's fair. Let's go ahead and put this up there.
That's the explicit ambition of its creators.
Right. I agree. And so yet in California, remember this, in 2020, the same time that the so-called Reparations Council was formed, well, guys, on a voter level, 57% of Californians, some 10 million people, voted against affirmative action. They voted against bringing affirmative action back in college admissions. So I think that this is a great approximator of how Californians, some of the most liberal, democratic-minded people in the country, even they don't agree with affirmative action. And there, we're talking about in-kind effective racial, benefits within the state system. Now we're talking about straight-up cash. Now, again, whenever it comes to the polling on this issue, it is somewhat complicated, and we had our team do a good job here. Let's go ahead and put E3 up there, please, on the screen. To the best of our ability, whenever it comes to the view of reparations and all of that, some 77% of Black Americans, compared with 18% of white Americans, do support reparations, specifically for the descendants of enslaved people. All of U.S. adults, though, the answer comes to no, 68%, and yes at 30%. For white Americans, it's 80, and then 18 for yes. Black Americans, it's 17 no, 77 yes. Hispanic Americans, 58, 39. Asian Americans, 65 no, 33. Amongst age groups, it's actually, unsurprisingly, kind of split up, 52-45 for ages 18 to 29, the majority, but slight majority saying no, who are younger. 30 to 49 is 63 to 34, 74, 24, 81, and 18. Now, in terms of the general polling here, there's some changes whenever it comes to income, which I find kind of interesting. So if you ask lower income Americans, the slight majority are still against, 54 versus 42. Middle income Americans, it's 74 and 24, and upper income Americans, 72 and 27. So lower income Americans more kind of on board with reparations, middle and upper middle class Americans generally against it. So I think it's important to put in the context of, in general, this is quote unquote divisive policy on the merits, just whenever you look at it. In terms of California itself, they have already rejected and voted against this effective type of policy. So then the question is this solving the problem that we want to solve? Right. And the problem that we want to solve is that we have had racial discrimination in this country that has manifested itself in economic disparity. Yeah. Now, what is the best way to do that? if you were to look at this policy, you would posit then that solving racial discrimination through economic inequities that have manifested is to have direct cash payments of some X sum to specifically Black Americans with a acknowledgement that what has happened there is obviously a moral crime and must be rectified. However, and I would posit this, and this is my kind of view of this. I wish Crystal was here. I'd like to hear also what she had to say. But I've held this position.
We need more white people in this conversation.
You're right. That's right. And actually, though, that's what it gets to is, at the end of the day, we are talking about taxpayer money. We are talking about a democratic problem, a small d democratic problem. So we all do kind of get a say as to how we want to address rights and wrongs that are all been done in our name. And the way that I've always looked at it is this. If you look at the lower income Americans that I referenced, they disproportionately include Hispanic, Black, and lower middle class and lower class white Americans. The wage gap between lower income white, Hispanic, and Black Americans is effectively marginal. So I would posit then that if you want to address racial inequity, one of the best things that you can do is just simply help all poor people. Because what will happen is that you will both increase the livelihood, the opportunity, and the disparity of past wrongs that were done, yes, specifically only to Black Americans, but you will also, at the same time, help lower middle class, lower income Hispanic and white Americans. And instead of pitting said groups against each other, you actually end up helping everybody. Now, of course, this is easier said than done. It involves possibly minimum wage increases. Maybe it involves cash transfers. Maybe it involves tax credits. A variety, a myriad of different ways that we could go about this. But that's kind of the framework where I'm coming at it from. Yeah. And I would say also that the framework that I'm coming at it from is dramatically more politically popular. And why does political popularity matter? Because we live in a democracy. We don't live in a unilateral dictatorship. I'm curious what you think.
You know, I think two things are absolutely true, and they can be true at the same time. One, that generational wealth disparities are very real and are very directly and obviously the result of explicit white supremacist discrimination policies that were baked into our constitutional system for far too long. On the other hand, I think it's also true that there's no way to mete out a reparations policy with a semblance of justice, because at the end of the day, proving this is going to be extremely difficult in a country where everyone is so mixed and has been mixed for years and years and years and years. So what justifies why one person, there are people who are, we're getting into like the grossness, the just absolutely repulsive, one drop, disgusting type racial science at a certain point, because what justifies somebody who is completely white, probably looks like me, who's able to trace their ancestry back to slavery. And that's, California does directly redlining in this proposal that you get X number of money up a certain year if you're, for each year you were affected by redlining policy in California. Probably easier to prove, and it can probably be proved more directly than slavery itself, but you're then going to take from Hispanic taxpayers money and give them, you may be forced to give them to people who look exactly like me and whose family has been in this country long enough to have been, for instance, likely on many sides of this conflict.
This is exactly why I think that trying to parse all of this is so ludicrous. And once again, I would say I am not against helping poor Black people or all poor people in this country. In fact, though, and this is why, trying to parse this, and I've never necessarily wanted to, but I think, possibly are forced to, is, you know what? There's better evidence to say that the worst economic hit that ever happened to Black Americans was the 2008 recession. Actually, the greatest wipeout of Black wealth in the history of the United States happened in 2008. It actually was not, necessarily redlining policies from Jim Crow, as disgusting, repulsive as that be. I'm not even necessarily comparing apples to oranges. What I'm saying, though, is that whenever we talk then about addressing, Black wealth and making it so that we can restore people to some sort of equality, not necessarily in terms of outcome, but in terms of opportunity, I would again then have to come back to the idea that we should look at the policies, the actual policies that led to the wealth disparity that we are right now, some of which include Jim Crow, but also now we're talking about 2008, which was a universalist kind of screw you to middle class and to poor people. And then say, well, is there some way you can normalize opportunity here across the board?
Yeah.
And by doing so, in general, as I've always come back to, I recommend Matt Brunegg, if anybody wants to go and look at it, has frequently looked at where actual wealth gaps are. My personal favorite statistic is you'll often hear in the media, like the white and the black wealth gap. Well, the truth is, sadly, is that the wealth gap between white and black Americans on an overall basis, the vast majority of that gap is between the top 10% of white people and the top 10% of black people, as in the top 10% earners of whites out-earn dramatically the top 10% of black. But if you take the median earner between whites and blacks, Hispanics, and others, like I said, the gap between those on a wage level is really not that big. And so if you want to help the most amount of people, increasing an overall wage in the economy has the actual benefit that we all come to.
Well, and we can't even have honest conversations about what's happened with entitlements and welfare state. And I know that gets into really hairy stuff, but Thomas Sowell can talk about this. Walter Williams can write about this, and they get cast as like white supremacists for raising some entirely legitimate questions about whether white liberals have wrecked the black community with well-intentioned but harmful policies that don't have, for instance, that aren't temporary enough, that aren't with the right incentives. And a lot of our audience probably disagrees with me on that. All I'm saying, though, is that we cannot even talk about the government structures that in some ways have been contributing to this, and I think very clearly, because it's just you get knocked down as a bigot or whatever, even if you're a black economist, like a celebrated black economist, for having that conversation. And again, the theme of the whole episode today is that we can't even perform basic functions as a society because we are so bogged down in these tribal divisions.
Correct. Well, we do have one update, though, for you whenever it comes to these reparations. They probably are not going to happen. Let's go ahead and put this up there on the screen. Despite the fact that they have been proposed and all of that, even the San Francisco Gate here is saying, quote, why they are likely doomed. One of the reasons why is that they say, whenever you've seen his way to make amends, the task force has spent the last 2 years. However, the package that is being discussed, even in terms of San Francisco, is some sort of one-time payments and all of that, even if they're formally adopted, never go into effect, is because of the U.S. Supreme Court. What they say is that the simplest form in terms of benefits is likely dead upon arrival because the idea of a particular race getting payments would almost immediately and certainly get struck down. This is Gabriel Chin, who is a law professor quoted from the UC Davis. Most likely to be at play would be the Equal Protections Clause in the 14th Amendment, which I was specifically speaking about, which said that any policy that sort people by racial categories known as racial classifications are typically seen as a violation of the Equal Protection Clause unless governments can provide, quote, a strong justification for them. So very likely, even if this were to try and to go into effect, it would face blockage at the U.S. Supreme Court. But who knows? We never know where we will get in terms of that. And even if they don't get implemented, the fact that they're on the table, I think, bore the discussion that we tried to handle sensitively here at Breaking Points.
Hey guys, ready or not, 2024 is fully upon us now, and Saagar and I have been brainstorming ways that we can really up our game for this critical election.
Yeah, we rely on our premium subs to expand our coverage, to add staff, to upgrade the studio. We just want to give you the best independent coverage of this election, which is possible. So if you can help us out, become a premium subscriber today, breakingpoints.com, or the link is down here in the description video. It really means the world to us, and if you like what we're all about, this is the best possible way to keep us 100% independent, working only for you.